Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar on racial equity in Kaleidoscope Play Learn. Let's talk about race. This is Kimberly speaking, and I am a family engagement specialist at Child Care Resources here in Seattle, Washington, and with me are my two team members.
So hi, this is Wisteria Oliver. I work with the Kaleidoscope Play and Learn program as a administrative specialist and contract monitor.
And I'm Tiffany Brace. I'm a current Master of Social Work student at the University of Washington, and I'm here as part of my education program.
Awesome. Well, we just wanted to take a moment to thank you all today for listening in on this webinar. It's a really important topic that is a really big part of the mission of Child Care Resources, so we appreciate the time that you're taking to be more involved with this subject. And Wisteria is going to go over our outline in just a moment.
Okay, so this is a webinar with a limited time frame, and not everything will be covered. But we do hope to cover some main points. We by no means consider ourselves to be the authorities on this topic. We just wanted to present this information as a starting place. So what we're kind of going to do today is we're going to go over some objectives, some suggested guidelines, and then the connection to child care resources. There'll be questions posed for you throughout this webinar for self-reflection. We'll go into some definitions, some data and history, and then we'll talk more from the child development perspective. And we'll be sure to make this relevant specifically to Kaleidoscope Play and Learn. And we'll actually go through some real-life examples that can hopefully help prepare you if these issues come up in your groups. So our main objectives for this webinar, like I was saying, we're not going to cover everything, but we're hoping that at least you will learn something new and maybe continue your own research after this is over. We're hoping to give you a better understanding of the ways that race and racial bias impact the experiences of families and children. And we're also going to try to help you all understand how this is a very important topic and maybe increase feelings of motivation and urgency in addressing these issues. So we're all at different places and spaces in our lives and in our social awareness. So the important thing is that, we're willing to have these conversations. And so here on this slide are just some suggested guidelines you may want to follow when having conversations such as these in your spheres, in your circles, at your Kaleidoscope groups, etc. So the home of the Kaleidoscope Play and Learn model is at Child Care Resources. And so we are interested in addressing racial disparities in Kaleidoscope Play and Learn because it is a part of the commitment of CCR to do this within our programs and within our community. So here on the screen we have the Child Care Resources mission and the Child Care Resources vision. So basically we want to make sure that we're supporting all young children and giving them a great start in school and in life. And how we do this is through our daily work, and part of that is definitely identifying and addressing the racism that occurs so that all children can thrive.
All right, so we have some self-reflection questions that we wanted to share with all of you because we really think that it's important that before you start having conversations with other people, whether that be children or adults or both, that a person takes some time to think about this topic privately and personally, related to how you may identify or comforts you may have on the subject, your opinions, your life experience that may impact how you view this subject. Having this type of reflection first, above anything else, can really help lead to more meaningful and effective conversations with other people. So some questions we have for you to think about are, what life experiences have you had that shape your views on race? What encourages you and discourages you from talking about race? What cultural values and history do you have that are important to consider? Are you comfortable talking about race? Why or why not? What is your knowledge about race and racism? And what do you want to learn more about? So these are some questions to get you started. We will have more questions at the end to give you all if you like these self-reflection questions and you want some more of them. And now Tiffany is going to give some definitions and explanations so that we're all on the same page.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So this is Tiffany, and yeah, I'm going to go through a few different definitions just as a way to set up a framework for this conversation and to hopefully make you feel like you know a little more what you're talking about and kind of can dig in a little deeper. So the first one we have is the difference between race and ethnicity. And we often think we know what these two things mean, but I think it can be a little more complicated than we think. So we're gonna watch the first part of a video really quick to get a better understanding of the differences.
And these videos will be at the end of the webinar as well. So if you want the link to them, you'll be able to watch it again if you'd like. Skip the ad.
How do you define race? If you had to describe why you think you're a member of one race and someone else was a member of a different one, you'd probably focus on appearances. Your skin, your hair, maybe even the structures of your bodies and faces. But most of the time, those physical criteria mean different things depending on the culture you're a part of. An obvious example is skin color. We use the words white and black to describe two races, but the distinction in skin color between those races isn't as clear-cut. A white person who spent the summer at the beach might come home with brown skin, but getting a tan doesn't change their race. And light-skinned black people may have skin that's not all that darker than that tan. Clearly, race is about more than just the literal color of someone's skin. So let's talk about race and why it's a topic that goes more than skin deep. Much like gender, race is a socially constructed category. In this case, it's used to categorize people who share biological traits that the society thinks are important. So you might be wondering, how can race be both a social construct and something based on biology? Well, the key part of that definition of race is the last part. What a society thinks is important. Sure, skin color varies widely across regions of the world, but so does eye color. And we don't consider people with blue eyes a different race than people with brown eyes. And while physical traits are often used to describe or identify a race, they're not always applied consistently. Take, for example, the so-called one-drop rule in the United States, where even the smallest amount of African-American ancestry is enough to classify someone as black rather than white. The opposite, however, isn't true. Someone with one black parent and one white parent is almost never considered white. Plus, people from different places or different time periods have defined racial groups differently. Nowadays, light-skinned people of European descent are typically considered white in the United States. It doesn't matter whether your heritage is British or Irish or Italian or Polish or German, you're just white. But that wasn't the case a century ago. In the early 1900s, anyone who wasn't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant was considered ethnic. So, for example, if you were Italian or Irish, you weren't considered white. Likewise, today, being Jewish is often seen as an ethnicity in the United States, but Europeans are more likely to think of being Jewish as a race. So that raises the question, what's the difference between ethnicity and race? Well, ethnicities are socially constructed categories based on cultural traits that a society finds important, rather than strictly biological traits. Essentially, an ethnic group is a group that has a shared cultural heritage. Language, traditions, religion, these are all types of culture that can determine your ethnic background. Two people of different races might share an ethnicity, and conversely, two people of the same race might be of totally different ethnicities. Japanese and Vietnamese people are both considered Asian, but they come from different cultural backgrounds. In fact, the term that many people think refers to race, Hispanic, actually refers to ethnicity.
Great. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of context for what we're talking about when we talk about race and ethnicity. So just kind of what she said as a review, race is used to categorize people who share biological traits that a society thinks are important. And then ethnicity is used to categorize people that have a shared cultural heritage. So that could be like language, tradition, and or religion. And the video goes on to talk about some of the specific complexities of race and ethnicity in the United States. So if that's something that's interesting to you, I encourage you to check it out. So one of the other important definitions here is implicit bias. So this implicit bias is the attitudes, stereotypes, and beliefs that can affect how we treat others. It's not intentional, which means we don't mean to do it, but it can still impact how we judge others based on different factors related to their ability, gender, culture, language, or race. And implicit biases have real impacts on folks that we interact with, and in early learning or in our KP&L groups, that can affect how we interact with little ones and their caregivers. When biases are based on someone's race, that's when we call it racism. So you can probably easily think of examples of explicit racism. This is the obvious stuff that gets talked about. But implicit racism can be harder to pinpoint, but it's just as harmful as explicit racism. So implicit racism is when individuals use unconscious biases when making judgments about people from different racial and ethnic groups. And it's an automatic negative reaction to someone of a different race or ethnicity than your own. Underlying and unconscious racist attitudes come out when a person is faced with race-related triggers. This can mean including observing differences or even just assumed cultural differences. Examples are unconscious fear, mistrust, or judgment of non-white people. So now we're going to watch another video. This video shows how implicit and explicit racism in our society affects how children think about race and form their racial identity.
The black doll.
Just skip ahead. Sorry, I thought it was restarting.
¿Cuál muñeco es bonito? ¿Cuál muñeco es feo? ¿Cuál muñeco es malo? ¿Cuál muñeco es malo? ¿Y por qué? Porque, bueno, este es morena y este es blanco. ¿Cuál muñeco es feo? ¿Por qué? Porque a mí no me gusta el color café. ¿Cuál muñeco te gusta más? ¿Cuál muñeco es bueno? ¿Y por qué? Porque no me doy miedo a los juegos porque tengo más confianza con los chicos. Un poco así como dices, no tengo mucha confianza. ¿Cuál muñeco es malo? ¿Por qué? No sé. ¿Cuál muñeco es feo? No sé, es que me parece que está un poquito, ¿cómo te diría? Más moreno y no se ve tan bien. No tiene mucho aspecto. ¿Por qué el muñeco blanco es bueno? Porque sus ojos son azules y todo su cuerpo es blanco. ¿Cuál muñeco es feo? ¿Por qué? Porque está negro. ¿Por qué ese muñeco es malo? Porque está café. ¿Y por qué este café es malo? Porque pesa. ¿Cuál muñeco te gusta más? Blanco. Porque sus ojos están bonitos y su raza también. ¿Cuál muñeco se parece más a ti? Un poquito a este. Es que soy un poquito güerita, de mis piernitas y de mis bad child. And she's
So take a moment to reflect on how that video, how it felt to watch that video. And if you're watching with others, or if you're watching alone, feel free to pause the video and take a moment to think about your thoughts and reactions and to share them with others if there are others around. Yeah, I think racism is so built into our society that sometimes we don't realize how much children pick up on. And even if they aren't often exposed to explicitly racist language and situations, they're picking up on the implicit racism that happens every day and internalizing it. So one of the other things that we need to understand is systemic or structural racism, which is a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work together in reinforcing ways to perpetuate inequities between racial groups. So it includes how our history and culture have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to happen over time and compound on each other. Structural racism is not something practiced among a few people or institutions, but it's part of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist. This cartoon illustrates how systemic racism, like police violence against people of color, impacts young people in our community. And Kim will be showing some more examples of structural racism in the early learning system. Another important distinction is the difference between equality and equity. Equality is where everyone gets the same resources. Equity is when each group is given what they need to have the same outcomes. So we need equity because racial disparities exist. Racial disparity exists when there are significant differences between racial and ethnic populations on indicators and specific circumstances. These can be things like access to care, services, or resources or opportunities, unequal treatment by or within systems and institutions, and community level outcomes, kind of like this graph shows, like graduation, employment, or indicators of well-being like income, health, and education. So racial equity would exist when we can't predict group advantage or disadvantage by race or ethnicity. So this can be measured through changes in specific indicators that show reduced gaps in racial disparities and reductions in racial disproportionality. So race is a predictive factor for educational and social outcomes in the United States, including kindergarten readiness. And disparities in kindergarten readiness and systemic racism lead to larger disparities in education and social outcomes over time. So for example, young people of color are less likely than their white peers to graduate from high school. And these disparities start very early, as Kim will discuss.
So Tiffany's conversation on definitions gives us a good foundation of knowledge and awareness, and some of the definitions that she talked about are concepts that we'll apply right now to some data that we'll be showing you. We won't spend too much time on data, but we did want to provide some examples of evidence of racial disparities that do exist. So this graph that you're looking at right now, is from the National Center for Children Living in Poverty, and it shows the percentage of children under age 6 in low income and poor families by race/ethnicity, and from 2015 is the source. And we chose this graph because it captures the age range from birth to 6, which is the age group that Kaleidoscope serves. And take a moment to look at this graph. If you're watching this with someone else, maybe have a conversation and just take a small pause and say what you notice about this graph. Something that you may notice right away is that generally overall, children of color are more likely to come from low income and poor families versus white families. So something, for example, that Tiffany discussed was racial equity. And so if we apply this concept to this data, for example, how would we know racial equity is achieved? When race or ethnicity is not a predictive factor of whether or not a child under 6 comes from a lower income household, that's when we know. But unfortunately, as you can see from the graph, right now it is a factor. Below the graph is a paragraph I took from another source called Racial Equity, or sorry, Equity Starts Early, Addressing Racial Equity in Childcare and Early Education. And I'm going to read this paragraph out loud because it's really nicely written and it delivers a really nice message. Barriers to equitable participation in early childhood programs. All low-income families face significant barriers to childcare and early education, but those barriers are particularly daunting for families of color, limited English proficient families, and immigrant families, all of whom face systemic barriers to successfully navigating public systems. The most common barrier are affordability, access, supply, and quality of care. In each of these areas, racial, ethnic, and linguistic minority families may face more complex and acute obstacles. These include cultural and linguistic barriers and those that result from persistent, deeply rooted racial bias. So when we talk about early learning, early education, all the names we have for the system, in our society, there are many barriers and challenges within it. And there are specific groups, like those highlighted in this paragraph, that have an even more difficult time overcoming certain obstacles and difficulties navigating the system. And this unfortunately creates a greater disadvantage for these populations. So if we know that young children who are low income or more likely to be children of color, which the graph shows, and we know that those families face significant barriers to early learning, what does this mean for how ready children are for school if early learning opportunities are difficult to access? So that leads into the second set of data that we wanted to show you, and the last piece of data that you'll see. This graph shows school readiness. And we already know that the birth to 5 age range is a really critical time for development, and it sets the foundation of life also for school. So the preparation during these years needs to happen, and children need access to quality early learning experiences so that they're ready for kindergarten. The data that you're looking at, unfortunately, it's not national data. I couldn't find national data on this topic because kindergarten readiness is measured differently per state. So this data comes for Washington State because Child Care Resources is based in Washington State. If you're not from Washington or you're not in Washington right now, I really encourage you to look at your state's school readiness data. It should be easy to find online. But anyway, this data is recent from 2017, and it shows the percentages of students who demonstrate characteristics of being ready when they enter kindergarten, and it's divided by race and ethnicity. And it looks at different areas: social, emotional, physical, language, cognitive, literacy, and math. And so again, just take a moment, maybe pause the video and just take a moment to see what you notice about this graph. And if you're watching it with someone else, maybe have a conversation about what is coming up. And after you take a look, you'll notice that there are many racial disparities in kindergarten readiness in Washington State across many different areas. Many of the bars are lower or higher than others. And again, if we go back to what Tiffany was saying with her definitions related to equality, equity, and racial equity, how could we apply this to this information in early learning? Equality would be that children would be given the same resources to be ready for kindergarten. On the other hand, equity would be that children are given resources that they need to have the same outcomes. In this situation, that outcome would be being ready for kindergarten. Racial equity is achieved when race and or ethnicity is not a predictor of whether or not a child is ready for kindergarten. And unfortunately, looking at this data, we see that it is. All right, so Brister is going to continue with some more information on preschool suspension, and we have a video to show you to lead into that. This will be our last video.
As educators, we are all deeply invested in creating positive experiences for our students. However, we now know that no one is immune to holding implicit biases that may adversely affect students, despite our best intentions. These biases can have a huge impact on our students' outcomes. To illustrate, let's explore what the research says about how teachers' perceptions of students' academic achievement is altered by implicit bias by looking at two studies. In the first study, children, accompanied by their caregivers, came into a research lab. Researchers watched and recorded the child's level of imaginative play with a set of toys. Imaginative play was ranked on a 1 to 5 scale from low to high, based on how creative the themes were within the child's pretend play. Additionally, teachers filled out reports about the students, which indicated whether they perceived the student to be prepared for school and the degree of conflict between that student and their peers. Upon examination, researchers found that ratings of imagination-based play differed based on the student's race. For Black students, those with highly imaginative play were rated as less prepared and less accepted by their peers. However, if the student was white, imaginative play was related to positive ratings in the same criteria. Without realizing it, the teachers in the study evaluated the same behavior differently based on the student's race. A second study examined the implicit biases of teachers in culturally diverse schools. A large group of white teachers filled out questionnaires about their experiences with white and Arab students in their classroom. Teachers also took an online assessment to measure whether they had a favorable or unfavorable inclination towards white or Arab students. Don't worry, we'll have more on this assessment in a later module. What's important to know is that the results of the study revealed a connection between positive implicit bias, educators' teaching styles, and engagement with students. In particular, those teachers with a pro-white bias were more likely to take a teach-to-the-test approach with non-white students instead of helping them master the content, compared to their approach with white students. But don't worry, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. The researchers also found that by using culturally responsive teaching methods, such as promoting mutual respect and resolving race-related conflicts, teachers were able to mitigate the effects of their biases. This goes to show that even though biases can be automatic and unconscious, they can still be inhibited.
So now that we've gone over some definitions,
You haven't seen the sun in like forever, so you switch for a beach vacation. Sunny beaches, sandy beaches, big beaches, small beaches, until you're lost. So
We'll just close out of that. Sneaky video and continue.
so we've seen a lot of data now, and we've looked at a lot of definitions, and so we're going to start bringing this now closer to home, closer to the populations we serve, and to Kaleidoscope Play Learn. So just to share one last piece of evidence for you all, the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights has found that Black children, specifically boys, suffer preschool expulsion rates at significantly higher rates than their white peers. So we're starting to see here that racial disparities are a big problem for our society at large, and unfortunately, we're seeing this creep into the early learning systems with very small children. It is important that we understand that this is happening and that we understand how to address it. So we're going to take a brief look, very brief, at history to understand how we got to the place we are now. It didn't happen by coincidence or accident. Systems in place a long time ago are still impacting us today. So on this slide, you'll see some history of legislation directly impacting children and families. So the first thing we want to bring up is the kind of first daycare models in America. They were actually in the 19th century. They were day nurseries and charities that cared for poor, often immigrant children, while their moms and parents were forced to work or look for jobs. So these programs serve children mainly by trying to assimilate them, trying to assimilate immigrants into American culture. And then as the Great Depression hit the United States, the government created programs to assist people and help them get back on their feet and help people out. But as these systems of support took shape, institutionalized racism and discrimination were embedded into the provision of these systems. So programs designed to provide economic relief to struggling Americans largely excluded people of color. One example of this would be, in the New Deal housing programs, that they were operated under strict regulations, determining which neighborhoods were safe to ensure mortgages. And due to the racism embedded in our culture, neighborhoods where residents were mostly Black, Jewish, or immigrant were deemed as hazardous, and they were redlined. And that meant that mortgage lenders refused to give loans to families in these neighborhoods who were otherwise credit worthy. And as a result, people who lived in redline areas couldn't get affordable mortgages in the neighborhoods in which they lived, but then they also couldn't move to desirable neighborhoods because federal regulations effectively mandated segregation. This shows, policies like this show that there has been a way that families or communities of color have been systemically blocked from accumulating generational wealth and security at the same level of other members of society. And another thing we want to point out here is Head Start. So Head Start came out of the civil rights movement, but unfortunately, Head Start is underfunded compared to the need that's out there. So and Head Start still exists today. It's a great program, but however, supply and access is an issue. And as we saw in previous slides, when you have odds stacked against you, competing or accessing this limited resource gets even harder. So now what does this have to do with Kaleidoscope Play and Learn? So we're seeing that racist policymaking in the past and in the present has persistent consequences for the availability of families to access quality childcare, culturally competent healthcare providers, and other community resources that support babies and young children's healthy development. Throughout history, and even now, rights and privileges have been granted to some and denied to others based on race and ethnicity. The history of colonization, slavery, segregation, and exclusionary immigration policies has undermined millions of Americans' health and well-being, and it's at the root of the racial and ethnic inequities that continue today. So changing the odds for young children requires us to understand how public policies, past and present, cause, perpetuate, or disrupt racial inequities. So as providers of the Kaleidoscope Play and Learn program, we're in a unique position. We interface with community members, we interface with community-based organizations, and politicians as well. So it's our responsibility and our duty to kind of raise these issues up. And also just to mention the Kaleidoscope program in Washington State, 63% of Kaleidoscope Play and Learn participants are people of color, and 49% of participants do not have English as their predominant home language. Groups are offered in many different languages, and the model of Kaleidoscope Play and Learn and allows for and encourages facilitators to reflect on the backgrounds, culture, and linguistic diversity of its participants. So this helps to allow access to early learning opportunities that are culturally and linguistically appropriate for diverse communities who might be farther away from opportunity. So Kaleidoscope Play and Learn is counteracting the racial disparities in early learning. And on this slide, we have just a couple of examples of kind of how we're doing that. So the program model itself is very culturally responsive, and it does address those barriers to access, and it is providing culturally and linguistically appropriate opportunities for families that might not be able to find it elsewhere. But also we see this with facilitators at their own Kaleidoscope groups. Facilitators are doing a really good job of incorporating different points of view and diversity into the groups with, reading materials, toys, games, cultures, having a culturally competent celebrations, making sure that no one's excluded. And there's some pictures here on the slides of this. And also Kim and Tiffany recently have been going out to groups and helping the participants link up with their legislators to kind of put Kaleidoscope Play and Learn on the map, put these communities on the map, and help kind of facilitate that conversation to let legislators and policymakers know that yes, we are out here, and yes, we matter, and we have a point of view, and we also count. So thank you for that, everyone. Now we're going to talk about how kids learn about race. So kids themselves are aware of race and absorb ideas about race from the social world around them, the implicit bias and actions of adults around them, and the media. So all this stuff forms what they think about race. And then kids form racial identities. They recognize that their race and racial group is a part of who they are and how others see them. Excuse me. Not talking about race increases racist thinking and racism. Talking about race is important. It helps to address these racial inequities. It helps to address the implicit bias that we've been talking about. Silence about racism has negative impacts. Kids think for themselves, but they also observe from those around them, particularly the influential adults and caregivers in their lives and their peers. So they reflect on what they see in their own beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors and interaction with others. So information about race is no exception. And so we're kind of hoping that, in an ideal world, us as adults, we will be able to help children in constructing a knowledgeable, confident self-identity, helping children to develop comfortable, empathetic interaction with diversity among people. We want to help children exercise critical thinking about bias, and we want children to have the ability to stand up for themselves and others in the face of bias. And in order to help kids do this, we need to be able to do this ourselves as well. So just from like a developmental point of view, we have some slides here that talk about the way kids start to learn about race. So a baby at 6 months typically uses their senses to learn about the world around them. So they're able to, see and feel. So they've started noticing skin color, hair texture, as well as different sounds of language and voices. A child of 18 months can correctly place a photograph of themselves in their racial or ethnic group. They can also select their own picture correctly in response to a group label. However, it's been found that they can't do either of these things consistently for pictures of other people. So at this 18-month-old stage, they're starting to understand themselves as a part of a group, but they don't quite understand how those around them fit into and form those groups as well. A child between 2 and 3 years is typically becoming aware of social prevailing negative stereotypes, feelings, and ideas about people, including themselves. We kind of saw that in the doll test. Those kids were a bit older, but we kind of saw how that goes. But that starts happening as early as 2 or 3. So it's been found that, kids this young may show discomfort, dislike, or fear toward a person whose skin color is darker than their own, or who speaks a different language, or who has a physical disability. Toddlers sometimes will refuse to play with the child because of these characteristics. A child of 4 years old typically seeks labels for racial or ethnic identity and is developing their own theories about what that means. And a child of 5 has usually developed a core sense of racial or ethnic identity and is beginning to explore what it means to be from one race or another. At this age, children are affected by societal bias, which can undermine their self-esteem and their ability to build a positive identity within their racial group. So it's important that adults are able to talk to children about race to help them make sense of what they're seeing around them and to help them navigate the society and situations that they will encounter. And so this kind of same developmental perspective is shown just on this other slide. It just breaks it up in a different way. So again, babies, they're seeing like the physical differences in the physical characteristics, and they can distinguish between white and black. Toddlers in pre-K age, they're starting to categorize and they're starting to use labels. And once they're up, 5 and above, that's when it's really starting to sink in all the loaded meanings that might be associated with these labels. So it's really important for adults to be able to help them navigate through this.
All right, in our next section, we're gonna go over how to talk to children about race. And what I have here on the slide isn't really, the end all be all. It's definitely just a starting point, something to launch you off with this subject. And as Wisteria has already said, which I'm going to emphasize, is that it's really, really important to talk about this topic. Silence about race means that there are lost opportunities for children to learn about race and diversity from the adults in their lives that take care of them. And that means that children may be more likely to go toward other sources like the media or misinformed sources about these topics where there's inaccurate information or stereotypes. So it's really important to break the silence and to talk about the subject and start early. It's going to talk about topics in general to the children that adults care for, and as a caregiver, as a facilitator. And just know that when you talk with your child, or a child in general, it's good for their development and for the bond between the adult and child. When you have these conversations, there are a couple of different approaches you can take. Race can be talked about in a couple of different ways, and this source is from the University of Washington. And it kind of outlines two different approaches. Race can be talked about biologically, so that means from a physical perspective, like skin color, facial features, and hair texture. And then it can also be talked about socially, relating to experiences like social norms, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. Typically, conversations about race will land in these two categories. So an example of how an adult might use this diagram in your life. Let's say you're a facilitator or you see a caregiver having a conversation about race with the child, and the child asks a question or makes a comment related to a social aspect of race, maybe a social norm. And after some conversations, the child doesn't really seem to be understanding what is said to them or can't really grasp the concept. And that's okay. That just may be that the child, depending on their age, is not quite developmentally there yet and may still be grasping what race is from a more biological standpoint. They may still be trying to process that there are people who have different skin colors and different hair types, and they can't quite understand social aspects yet. So that's an example of how you might apply this diagram. In addition to the biological versus social method, there's also preventive versus reactionary conversations. And this, I think, is a really interesting tool to use. Reactionary conversations about race would be when some kind of event or incident happens that makes a child make a comment or ask a question. And when that happens, an adult will intervene and provide some kind of explanation or dialogue to the child or with the child to help them understand. And a preventive conversation, on the other hand, is when race is talked about not as a result of like an incident or an event or a child's comment or question. It's a conversation that's had to foster understanding and dialogue. It's not a conversation that happens because of an event. It's very proactive. It's not waiting for something to happen. You can have it naturally, organically, or you can be intentional in bringing up the topic. So this is useful to think about because when you think about the conversations you have with children, you might notice, oh, a lot of the conversations I have are reactionary. I wait until something happens to have this conversation. And you might think, well, maybe it might be good to have some preventive conversations and bring up this topic maybe through a book at story time before an event happens that will spark this conversation. In addition to preventive conversations and reactionary conversations, it's also good to think about these conversations versus actual experience. So for example, facilitators and caregivers can balance conversations about race with real life experiences out in the community and at home. So for instance, reading children books about race or reading books that represent a variety of different people, going to community events that involve people from different ethnicities and cultures and backgrounds and so on, are really great ways to frame these types of conversations. Children do notice whether adults in their lives surround themselves with diverse activities and peoples, and it's really important to be a role model. If the adults in a child's life does so, the child will be more likely to do it in their lifetime. as well. So with this topic, you still may be thinking about like, how would I even approach this question about race a child has, or approach this topic? And you may be thinking now like, oh, I really want to have more preventive conversations about race. A way you could frame this is to talk about family and friends. When talking about race, you can make it so that the child can connect to it. So for example, you could talk about the race and ancestry of the child's family, caregivers, friends, neighbors, and so on, and encourage the celebration of that child's culture and traditions that they have at home. Encourage and foster love for learning about traditions of other peoples. This may help the child understand more about how race involves them and the people that they love who are around them, and not just people in books or TV shows or films. It also helps really it also helps foster, a sense of belonging and the child's healthy identity development, which is really important during the early years. One thing I also wanted to just wrap up this slide with is talking about stereotypes and thinking flexibly. And the reason why I want to emphasize this is that stereotypes can be very hurtful and accurate and disrespectful, and it is likely that they will come up in your conversations related to race. And so to give an example of what we mean by flexible thinking, I'll use this diagram again as a tool to explain this. On the right side, under the social branch, it has a picture of a pair of chopsticks. So we will use that as our example. So let's say you're at your Kaleidoscope group, you're a facilitator, there's the community potluck you're hosting that day, and some participants bring food and different utensils, and one of them are a pair of chopsticks. And a child asks a question, and they're curious about what it is. And it may be that they've never seen chopsticks, or they know of them but never seen them in real life. And they ask about it. They ask what it is. They're curious. And in response, you may say something like, people eat in all sorts of different ways. Some people eat with their hands, forks might be used, spoons, knives, or chopsticks. And it just depends on the person's preference, what they like, or maybe where they come from. And the way that child eats at home may be different than the way someone else eats at home. But that's okay, because not one is better than the other, it's just different. And depending on the child's development and age, if they're a little bit older, you might have a conversation about where chopsticks come from. They come from certain parts of Asia, and that there are many Asian people that use chopsticks. But this is where the flexible thinking part comes in. There are also many people who are Asian who don't use chopsticks or don't know how to use them. And then there are also people who aren't Asian that know how to use them and do eat with them. And so just because you see an Asian person does not mean that they eat with chopsticks. So that this type of flexible thinking is really important to have to show a child early on. It helps prevent stereotypes and teaches them to think critically. And again, related to being a role model, if the adults in a child's life are thinking this way, then they are more likely to think about it this way too. And this can be applied to other concepts as well, like hair and clothing and how people greet other people. It's the same thing. So hopefully this will provide more information for you and preparation and how to think flexibly related to stereotypes when talking about race with the children in your lives. Here are some tips that we have, just some short snippets, things that you could do when having these conversations. One of them is being that try not to change the subject quickly or ignore the child if they ask a question or make a comment. This makes the impression that the subject is strange, or maybe if they ask a question about a person, maybe that there's something wrong with that person. Try to clarify the question if it was asked. Try to understand what the child wants to know. It may not be what you think. And when you do respond, definitely use language that is simple and brief, and use words that the child can understand. Also try to figure out the child's feelings behind the question. It just may be a simple curiosity, or it may be something deeper. Maybe an event happened that you didn't know about and they're uncomfortable. If a child is pointing and you are uncomfortable, you can come up with a system or a code that you can use with your child so that they can let you know that they're curious about a person without having a pointing situation or making other people around you uncomfortable. And then also know that this is not a one-time conversation. weaving talking about race into their life is really important, and it could be done on a regular basis. So now you're probably thinking again, how can I apply this to my Kaleidoscope Play and Learn group? And there are actually a lot of ways you can do that. In general, just thinking about all the information that we've given you already, which we know is a lot, just kind of take some time to absorb it and look at your Kaleidoscope Play and Learn group through a racial equity lens now. Knowing that your group has lots of books and toys and materials, do you think that those items reflect the types of people who are in your group? Do they reflect different races? That's something you can think about. We also already know that children learn through play, and play is a guiding principle of the Kaleidoscope program. Does your KP&L environment that you've created foster space for children to play and learn about race in your setting? Are there things that you could do in your group to make it more inclusive of all backgrounds? So those are some questions you can think about. Caregiver learning is an enormous part of the program, and this is a really great pathway to integrate this topic. Caregiver learning can be done in so many different ways, and specifically for this subject, you can interweave it in your group in a way that you think is best for your participants, but also in a way that you're comfortable with. So for example, you could give out resources, different pamphlets, information to caregivers about how children develop and learn about race for them to take home, or you could have a poster on a wall. You can have story time and choose a book related to different skin colors or hair textures, or, for example, and have a short conversation after the story time and let caregivers know how important it is to expose children to these types of topics. On the flip side, you could also have one-on-one conversations with folks and teach them how their child playing with different types of dolls that look different is helpful in teaching them about race and diversity. Other topics would be you could, for example, go to a museum or invite a guest speaker to come and speak, or have a conversation or activity where everyone is invited to bring items that reflect their family backgrounds and ancestries, and people could do a show and tell. So there are lots of ideas here that can be had, and many of you are probably already doing this, which is awesome, and I encourage you to keep doing it. Consistency is really important, especially with caregiver learning and the Kaleidoscope program, to make sure that messages are being delivered. All right, so in this next section, we're going to go through a few different situations, scenarios, so that you get some experience with some real life events that might happen in your group if they haven't happened already. And you can prepare yourself and think about how you would address these situations. So in the next few slides, I'm going to pose a scenario related to race, and then we'll talk about a good response, or a way that you could respond to these questions or comments. So let's say you're at your group and you're a facilitator, and a 5-year-old boy notices a caregiver sitting next to him, and he stares at her and asks, "Why is your skin so dark?" Or maybe he asks, "Why is your skin so white?" So depending on your comfort in talking about race, you may be nervous when you hear this, or you may not be, but it's okay. Just thinking about what we talked about in this webinar, you know that this conversation is going to be about biology. It's going to be about the physical aspect of race. And that relates back to the two approaches on how to talk about this topic, biological or social. You also know that this isn't a preventive conversation, it's a reactionary conversation, because it is a conversation that's sparked by a child's question. And also it seems that the child is just curious and looking for information. So again, you want to answer promptly. Think about how you would answer that question. Take a pause for a moment. And after you reflected, maybe think about how others around you, other co-facilitators you have, might respond. A way that you could respond to this question is to let that child know that people are born of different types of skin color. And sometimes a person is born with lighter skin or darker skin, and one isn't necessarily better than the other, it's just different, and all skin colors are beautiful. And skin color is just one part of a person, and we need to get to know people fully to understand like who they are and what they're like. That's a very simple explanation. If the child is maybe a little bit older or more further along in their development, that's when you may have a conversation about what melanin is and how humans and animals have melanin in their skin to protect them from the sun. And some people have less melanin, some people have more, and that's why we had different skin colors. And that's really for a slightly older age, but that may come up also in your group. So know that leaning on biology and science a little bit to guide the conversation about race is definitely an option. This question that is on the slide, this scenario is more of a mild question, but there may be times when a child has a comment or says something that is, you might feel is extremely embarrassing, or maybe the adults around are extremely uncomfortable because what was said was so offensive. That may happen, and that's totally okay. It's important not to blame the child. It's not necessary that they're saying that because they're trying to be harmful or to be mean. It could just be that they're looking for information, or they're trying to process and understand the world around them and maybe a difference or observation that they made. And so really, if something like this happens, know that this is still a learning opportunity and that it's a space to exchange ideas and feelings, and to really take the time to understand how the child is feeling and where that comment or question came from. It may be that they heard it from someone else, or it may be that they're just processing something. All right, so the next situation that we have is scenario 2. And let's say you're a facilitator and you're facilitating circle time like you do every week. And this time there is a 3-year-old that touches the hair of her peer and notices the texture. And she asks very loudly as everyone is in a circle and it's very quiet, "Why is your hair so weird?" And then there's the silence. So a very simple way that you could possibly approach this question would be saying, "Her hair is very straight and long. It feels and looks different than yours, doesn't it? Your hair is very short and frizzy and curly. These are different types of hair and both are very nice." Very simple, using words that likely a 3-year-old would understand, and ending on a positive note that both hair types are very nice. And again, if caregivers are listening to this, this is great caregiver learning. You are modeling and showing an example of how to address these types of questions. And then it's also great to follow up. Next week, you could have a variety of different books laid out during group, or pick a book on hair types for story time. And here are some examples of books you could choose from. At the end, we'll also have a book list for you all to look at if you're interested in children's books about race that you can incorporate in your group. The next scenario is scenario 3. And in this situation, you, the facilitator, or maybe a caregiver you notice, may address a child's question or comment, but may be disappointed on how it was delivered, or maybe in that moment, the adult was not able to answer the question for whatever reason. That's totally okay. We're not all perfect. And what's most important is that there is a follow-up. So for example, if an adult needs some more time before answering a child's question or comment, maybe they need advice from someone else, or maybe they need to do a little bit of research, it's okay to say, "I need time to think about your question. We'll talk about this soon." When you are ready, it's okay to come back to the child and say, "Yesterday you asked me a question about this. Let's talk about it now." And if you really didn't like how you answered something, you can let them know and be honest and tell them that you're disappointed about how you answered their question and that you have a better response now for them. So again, no matter how you go about this, just remember that it's better to not let it go and to follow up if you can. Our last situation is scenario 4. And let's say that you're totally inspired by this webinar and you decide to talk about race in your group through whatever medium you choose. And a caregiver lets you know that their child can't speak yet, so the topic of race is not important. So first of all, I want to note that we can't force these conversations, and when someone is willing to speak about this subject, that's when we know it's going to be more effective and meaningful. So just know that and respect a caregiver's perspective and choice. At the same time, if someone is willing to have a dialogue with you, that's really fantastic. And you can let them know that, as Wisteria has mentioned, that infants notice skin color at a very early age. And so it's really important to start early on this topic if you can. Talking to children who are nonverbal is really great for their development and for their language growth, and also for, again, the relationship between the adult and child. And it's important to talk to them about all sorts of topics, but in a way that's developmentally appropriate. So for example, for an infant, it may not make sense to talk about, race in the prison system. That's not probably appropriate. But what you can do is to talk about things at a much more basic level, like talking about grandpa and grandma and where they come from, or maybe how you identify, or the family ancestry. Conversations like these are really important to foster a sense of belonging and identity, especially cultural identity. And it's really important that these conversations are had during this critical time of development from birth to 5. The earlier you have these conversations, the more beneficial it is, even if the child is not speaking yet. If you practice now, it'll be much easier to have these conversations later on when the child is able to talk and ask you questions and make comments and so on. So in short, start early, practice, and break the silence about race. This is the whole reason why we're having this webinar, is to really show you how important it is to talk about this topic. So we talked about situations at the Kaleidoscope group level, and we just want to take time to talk about this racial equity lens from a more program and organizational level. So these are just some questions to think about. Maybe you're a supervisor, maybe you work at the admin level, and you have different programs and policies that are implemented within your organization that affect the families you serve, including children. And some racial equity questions to consider when you're creating programs or making decisions, whatever it may be, is to think about whether or not it's good for families, kids, and early learning educators of color. You can also think about, do some families, kids, or educators benefit more or less than others? Do some have more access to something or not? Why? And are there any unintended consequences? So some reflection questions to think about. And as we're wrapping up, we just want to let you know that this is a huge topic and you do not need to be the expert on this topic or have all the answers. We definitely do not have all the answers with us. But it is really important to be welcoming, supportive, being willing to learn, and available to have these open and safe conversations about race within the Kaleidoscope setting. And really encourage you to incorporate what you learned today, even if it's just one thing, and to share it with your caregivers. And obviously, as you need support, please definitely reach out to us and let us know what we can do to help. We also want to just wrap up and let you know that early learning is a field that, yes, does have racial disparities, but so do many other fields like housing, education, employment, and incarceration. And in order to address these racial disparities, it's really important to talk to our young generation, specifically our children, about race in a way that they can understand, and to foster this understanding at an early age, really for the sake of our future and knowing that our children are our future. So it's really important that we prepare them now for what's ahead and help them navigate the world. One final thought I do want to make is that as you're implementing this into your programs and your groups, truly consider what it would feel like for participants to receive this type of information and material, and to think about your race and the race of your participants and the families you serve and how that may influence this delivery, and to also consider co-leading groups when you're having this discussion about this topic. So overall, this work is ongoing, and we hope that you continue to have this conversation and that this was useful.
So as you can tell, we're nearing the end of the presentation. So this is a great time to take a moment to reflect on the questions you see in front of you. Just think about something new that you learned today, and maybe something new that you would like to apply to your Kaleidoscope Play and Learn group. And then I encourage you to share that with someone at your organization or in your network, just to start practicing talking about these kinds of things. And then the next few slides are going to be resources, references for you. So like Kim talked about, these are more of those self-reflection questions we had earlier in the presentation. And this is great for really digging into how you think about race and racism, how you were raised, what your comfortability is with it, a lot of really self-reflection and digging in digging in that way. And then Kim has compiled a lovely list of children's book suggestions, like the ones that she talked about that talk about different types of hair. There are ones that talk about skin color and all the different types of people in the world. So there are great options here. And then this slide is actually great places to find books on race, diversity, and social justice. So definitely check those out.
And here are our resources slide. I just want to point out the first couple of links are links to some modules that we found were really interesting and helpful on this topic. And the diagrams that you saw earlier about biology versus social and preventive versus reactionary and so on came from these modules. So I really encourage you all to take a look at them. They're audio recorded, and there's also the written version, so you can listen to it, or you could read it depending on what you prefer. And again, just some other resources for you to look at that if you're interested in also sharing with caregivers in your Kaleidoscope Play Learn groups. We also have some videos that we shared that we linked here, and additional videos for you to look at as well. I encourage you all, if you're not in Washington State, to look up specific resources in your home state that you can share with folks in your program. If you are in Washington, there are a couple that we want to share with you all related to King County, but also the information that they have there also, I think, is relevant for really anyone across the state, but also in the country as well. It's all good information. So if you have any questions about this topic, definitely reach out to us. Here is our information, email address or phone number. Thank you so much again for joining us today and deciding to listen to this topic. It's really, really important that we talk about this subject, and we're really glad that you took the time to do this with us. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks.